Hi everyone, welcome to the second panel of the second day of CyFy 2019. I hope everybody is having a really great time, and we have a really interesting panel coming up. It's called Countering Violent Extremism, and we have a really comprehensive, eminent panel and a number of people who are well equipped to speak about this. So first of all, let me just introduce everyone that's sitting right here, starting with let's see. Right. Chill, it's gonna be lunch. So starting with Ms. Latifa Akarbak, the President of the High Authority of Audiovisual Communication and also the Vice President in Office of the Network of African Instances of Communication Regulation. And then we have Franz Josef. He works at Moonshot CVE, which is like a really great tech platform which is countering violent extremism and also has some partnerships with Google. And then we have David Scharia, the head of mission for the UN Security Council on Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate. And then we have Mariam Wardak, the founder of Her Afghanistan, and she was a former strategic planning advisor to the Ministry of Narcotics in Afghanistan. So to begin with, if I could just ask some of my panelists, just to begin with, why are we talking about counterterrorism now, and why is it so relative? Ms. Latifa, would you like to speak?
Okay, thank you. I think that we should talk more and more about radicalization narrative and hate of speech, because it's really a great concern, not only at the multilateral or the global level, but also in each of our countries. It's really important to be aware that the regulation issue, as it was raised in the previous panel, is not only about technology regulation. That's why I am very happy and I am thankful to the organizers that we, African media and communication regulators, were invited to participate on this very important. Why is it important? First, I think that now there is a kind of international consensus about the emergency of tackling, of facing up, of really struggling against this hate speech. Second, in our continent, it's really important. It's in the core of our democratic work. In the previous panel, President Zapatero talked about ethics. Okay, I think that in our continent, we don't have to be insensitive to this problem. We don't have to be the continent of the technological gap and also the continent of ethical gap. That's why it's important to reinforce, to consolidate the action of media and communication regulators. We regulators of the content, not of the technology. We are part of the solution. The challenge is how, at the same moment, to take benefit, to take advantage of this digital transition, of these wonderful new assets of our technological revolution, and in the same moment to protect society to prevent society from hate speech. That's why regulation is an issue, a very, relative issue, and it is not always about technology. It is also, and maybe mainly, about the content. That's why also, and I will finish with that, what is going on now about the self-regulation of the GAFA, of these majors, it's really an important issue, and we have to be vigilant. You know, nobody now has the evidence that there is algorithmic neutrality. I think nobody will believe that one day the algorithm will be neutral. But this is why it is important in Africa to exchange on this issue and to have and to advocate for a kind of African perspective Technology is global. The international community is facing the same challenges. So the response to the hate speech, to radicalization, to far-right movements narrative, for Islamophobia narrative, for Daesh and narrative, it's a global issue. I end with this. You know, maybe on the field battle, Daesh is maybe lost some field, but the propaganda is still alive in 30 languages. We are still be exposed to many hate speech. So it's everybody concerned.
Wow, thank you. That was really, really comprehensive. Thank you. Franz, what do you have to say to all of that? A government official has already said that it's a problem, and maybe technology can help, or can we counter all of this? And as Ms. Latifa was saying with the algorithms, can it ever solve any of these problems?
Thanks, Regina. And thanks for these questions. I think I'd like to start off maybe with talking briefly about what Moonshot is and what we are doing. Moonshot is a startup company that is based in London in the United Kingdom. We have been founded a couple of years ago in 2015. And what we do is we fight violent extremism in the online space. So what we do is we develop technologies and methodologies in order to identify at-risk individuals in the online space. Secondly, to understand their online behavior, their belief systems, the values, the narratives they engage with. Thirdly, we create and curate content that resonates with these people. And then fourthly, we redirect them away from the harmful propaganda that is out there to positive and constructive messaging. One of the methodologies that we are using is called the redirect method, which we have developed in collaboration with Google's tech incubator, Jigsaw. And we also have something that we call the tracker, which is a methodology that was developed by ourselves and which we use in order to map the appetite for violent extremism in the online space across various platforms. So for instance, we look at social media profiles where we find what we call performative data, so information that people put out there in order for it to be seen. So that's why we call it performative data. But the tracker, for instance, also works on Google search. So we are tracking searches, very specific searches that indicate violent extremist or appetite for violent extremism. And it is especially these searches that are very interesting for us, because usually when you go on Google, you do not expect that your searches are visible to others. However, we can see them through the tracker, and this is very interesting data precisely because it is meant to be secret. And it gives us information about what people feel, what people desire, what kind of content people are engaging in. So this is a little bit the work that we are doing. We are working across many different countries. We have worked in over 30 countries to date, all across the world, in Africa, Asia, America. We work on various types of violent extremism. I always highlight in these kinds of settings that we should not just talk about jihadism or violent jihadism. A big problem in Europe, for instance, at the moment that we are also researching is the rise of the violent far right in America and in Europe. But we also have things like the incel movement, the movement of involuntary celibates, which openly propagate violence against women, for instance. So there are various different forms of violent extremisms in the internet. I would say one of the important tools that we are using in our work are the advertising platforms of tech companies such as Google. So we use Google and we feed the advertising platform of Google with large databases of online indicators that indicate risk or appetite for violent extremism in order to identify people and link them up with constructive and positive messages. So this is a very good example, I believe, for how we can repurpose existing technology, which has been made in order to sell products, for a public safety purpose. And we are constantly trying to improve the use of, for instance, the Google advertising platform for our purposes. We not just do campaigning and messaging. One important aspect of our work is also intervention work. So we can use technology in order to link at-risk individuals in the online space with service providers, with intervention providers that help to off-ramp people from violent extremist processes and help them reintegrate into society. And yeah, I think this is an important point. I also want to stress one thing, if I may, still. When we talk about violent extremism in the online space, we should not conceive of it narrowly as content removal and takedowns. A lot of people always speak, oh yeah, violent extremism in the online space, let's take down the content. And this is a good first approach, no doubt about that, but I think we should not stop with that, because what we see in the online space is when you remove harmful or violent content, you do not make the individual disappear that was looking to engage with this content. This individual is still there, and it is vulnerable, and it is at risk. So we should use the existing technologies that we have to link these vulnerable individuals with service providers in the offline space, with off-ramping services, so that they can reintegrate into society. The problem with focusing only on content removal is that it's a bit of a whack-a-mole thing, because if you remove content on one platform, say Facebook, violent extremist groups and their audiences, they will move to more niche platforms, such as, for instance, I don't know if anybody has heard 4chan or 8chan or Gap, which are very important for instance, the Christchurch shooter, published his materials on 8chan, or the shooter that was involved in the Pittsburgh attack in the United States a couple of months ago used 8chan. So these are very niche platforms that do not have these takedown policies. So our message is always that when we talk about violent extremism in the online space, let's not just talk about content removal, that's the first step, but let's also talk about how we can identify these individuals and engage with them in a constructive way and off-ramp them and provide them with services to reintegrate into society.
Thank you so much, Franz. All right, moving over to David Scharia, Head of Mission for the UN Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee. Apparently, there's quite a few things this Counterterrorism Committee is doing, especially with some of the biggest technology platforms. I'm not quite sure how many of us know about it, but David, if you could start by talking about the initiatives taken by your work, I think that would be great.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I want to start perhaps a few words with answering your prompting question of why terrorism and technology. And the main reason that terrorism and technology go hand in hand is because both terrorism and counterterrorism have moved in the last few years from being, how should I say it, a low-tech industry to a very high-tech industry. Terrorists themselves are now able to master the entire terrorism cycle, as we used to call it, through technology, from radicalization and recruitment over to financing of the attack, coordinating of the attack itself, perpetrating, and then even the responsibility after. So the entire terrorist cycle today happens through technology. And the same applies to counterterrorism. It's not anymore a thief and a policeman chasing each other in the streets. It's a high-tech industry that uses some of the most sophisticated technologies, big data, artificial intelligence, biometric intelligence. So if we are to speak on terrorism and counterterrorism, we have to speak a lot and to know a lot about technology and the role it plays in both sides of the equation. When it comes to CVE, indeed, our office has been deeply engaged in this, and I would like to say from the start that it's not only an online battle. I agree with the comments made earlier, but part of it certainly takes place online. And some 2 years ago, we invited Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Twitter to work with us on an initiative that tries to take down together content. One of the challenges back then was that if something was taken off Facebook, it immediately re-emerged in one of the other platforms. Now, I agree it's not the whole solution, but it's an important component of the solution is to make access to those to this content more difficult. So the 4 companies established together with us what is known right now as the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism. And it is, after 2 years, a huge success. Research has shown that more than 98% of content that is developed and promulgated by Daesh and Al-Qaeda and others is brought down in the 4 platforms before it's even uploaded. The algorithms that have been developed are very, very effective. Now, 2% or 1% that is left, taking into account the amount of data that is uploaded, leaves a lot to work on, but it's not that environment that we've seen 3-4 years ago. The next step, and what we're doing now, is to try to promulgate the knowledge, going on the points made earlier by my colleague to the left, is to try to bring that knowledge to smaller companies. So they will also be able to take down content. And that knowledge is complex. It requires algorithms, it requires hashing of certain videos, and it requires also human knowledge of what is terrorist content or not. I don't want to take too much of the time. I know we're in a bit pressed, so I'll stop here and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, because Mariam is one of our most passionate speakers, and she has a lot to say, and which is great. I think before lunch we need this kind of enthusiasm. Mariam, could you please explain a little bit about Her Afghanistan, your new initiative, and why are you so passionate about counterterrorism?
That is an example of propaganda. Just want everybody to know. Thank you so much. It's quite stressful to be on such a panel with such esteemed colleagues of mine. I have ground experience. I'm from Afghanistan. Her Afghanistan is a platform for, it's a virtual platform for everybody to include any type of recommendations they have for women in security, tech, and foreign policy. There's not very many experts in Afghanistan, and I feel that the women in Afghanistan are not able to gain as much experience from there. But I'm here to talk about CVE and the role that I've had in my previous jobs. I was at the Office of the National Security Council, and I was one of the core members that was developing the CVE strategy there. And I realized the challenges in the sense when it came to technologies and how to include technology when it came into the strategy. The 3 technologies and digital tools that we all do use is narrative when it comes information sharing and non-government solutions. So I want to speak about the downside to technology. I know we're all about how positive technology is. Technology has a huge negative side that we have to reflect upon to make sure that we improve our ways moving forward. So technology is a great tool for insurgents and terrorism, as David mentioned earlier. And we have to keep in mind that when you're trying to counter narratives, there's so much information out there in the digital world that you are monitoring. By the time some of our policymakers get that information and then they go to counter it, it's too late. It's already impacted the constituents. So instead of countering narratives, I think it's best to start creating more fun, more interactive narratives where it's a constant engine that's flowing and we don't have to take a stop moment to make and lose that opportunity that we have to influence the constituents. Technology isolates all of us. One of the main reasons for recruitment is that these individuals need a sense of belonging. So the more opportunities, the more for individuals to be on the technological platforms, it isolates each individual, which is why terrorist groups and insurgents use it as one of their tools. They actually directly interact with all of the constituents, whereas the government, unfortunately, does not. One of the main aspects that we keep forgetting is that we're giving free publicity to terrorist groups and insurgents. That is what technology is also doing. We have not humanized technology. I've noticed one thing. Everybody is talking about how technology is replacing humans and not talking in the sense that technology is an added feature to us. We are the ones who've created technology, so we have to remember this. Technology needs to be an added feature in the sense of how we're interacting with the population, how are we forming policies. The discussions that I had earlier is that nowadays you get phone calls and it's a robot. I mean, it's a machine asking you how many people are living in your house, how many of you go to school, how many of you are working. Insurgents and terrorist groups build a relationship with the constituents. They sit down, ask them how many people are in your family, what's bothering you, why are you sad, why do you feel alone? Imagine if the government has taken such an approach to connect with its citizens. The sense of belonging is very important. I stress this very much. We cannot have a one-way communication. The great thing about social media these days is that it's a two-way communication. We need to interact with each other much more. One of the other downsides of technology, this digital mean, is that it's become such a great recruitment tool. It's also become a great place to connect with individuals that we would never have connected to. So, I mean, there's pros and cons to each side. I just want everybody to be aware of it. The recommendations that I want to give to all of the policymakers is to keep in mind of humanizing your content and your material. And if possible, not to make it all robotic. Engagement and micromanaging is not going to help us on any platform, and it will only help increase the recruitment for the enemy. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mariam. And as Mariam finishes, Ms. Latifa says she has counter comments to what Mariam was saying, that the government is going about it all wrong, or should we be doing something different?
Yes. No, actually, I agree with all what you said. Just I wanna make a comment about this question. Is it good or not to create counter-narrative? I would like to say that I do believe, especially in the African context, in the Arab world context, even if I hate this expression, because the Arab world doesn't exist. It's a mediatic creation, but it's another issue. So, you know, in some countries, internet, the web, is still considered, or is mainly considered as an alternative vehicle of freedom speech. And because of this, there is a high level of trust, just because it is considered as alternative. So the level of vigilance is low for many other reasons. And you know, when people, vulnerable people are trapped in this hate speech or radicalization speech, there is a new situation from them. They are isolated from their community and put in a new trapped in a new virtual community, and they are face to face to one sort of speeches. That's why it is really important to habilitate, to raise our skills in terms as societies, our media, to create a new offer, this counter-narrative offer, but be careful. It is not propaganda against another propaganda. We have really first to consolidate our knowledge about how it is working. What are the expectations of our young people? How to do for the best, not to be in this state of mind saying, yes, there is a propaganda, we have to produce propaganda. So we have to have an expert approach, and also to be aware that the challenge is really great. It's a democratic issue, because when you examine the hate speech, how it is working, you know, the hate speech is isolating people while democracy is trying to include people. The hate speech and the radicalization ideology is trying really to operate by polarization, the religious polarization, cultural polarization, while democracy is trying to build citizenship and to strengthen the social link.
First of all, Franz he said he wanted to go first. Franz, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also say something about this issue of counter-narratives, because this is something that Moonshot has worked on quite a bit. And what we have found in our research is precisely that it's not just about ideology when we talk about countering violent extremism. It is actually a lot also about individual vulnerabilities of people that drive radicalization and make people more vulnerable towards radicalization. So we are talking here about, for instance, the family situation of people, loneliness, drug abuse, the criminal record of people can have an impact on a person's vulnerability with respect to violent extremist messaging. And what we have found in our research is actually that a lot of the violent extremists are quite adept at exploiting these individual vulnerabilities. And I would like to maybe mention one brief story or anecdote from my work that I'm doing in the Maldives. So one of the countries that I'm working on at the moment are the Maldives. I think you all know the Maldives as a country of high luxury tourism. But it's not just that. The Maldives also has a radicalization problem. There are reports out there that say that up to 200 Maldivians have joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Middle East during the heydays of ISIS. So what we have found in our research is that a lot of the Maldivian young men that have joined ISIS and Al-Qaeda were actually men that had a history of drug abuse or a criminal record. And often these young men, they come to a point in their life when they are trying to make amends, they're trying to reintegrate into society, they want to redeem themselves. And also because the government doesn't provide any support services, they end up with radical preachers, with radical sheikhs who tell them, oh, if you want to come back into the fold, go and fight the kuffar, go and take up arms to enforce a very, radical version of Scharia in the Maldives, or go and join ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Now, and this is research, actually, that we can do in the online space, because the traces and clues that people leave behind on their social media profiles, they can be analyzed, and these vulnerabilities can be analyzed, and then the messaging and the engagement that we do with these violent extremists and the at-risk audiences also need to take these vulnerabilities into account. And maybe just very briefly, we actually did some testing, for instance, with mental health messaging. So we found that in some of our tests, we found that messages that contain mental health messages or messages related to loneliness, a lot of extremists are more likely to click on those and to engage with that type of content. So that is content that is focused on mental health and loneliness, for instance, as opposed to content that is focused on ideological messages trying to counter ISIS and Al-Qaeda propaganda.
Okay, just one quick question, David. Franz, when you said mental health messaging, what kind of messages? As in, are you looking for help kind of messages?
Yes, so these would be messages that would basically ask the question if you need help, and then what we sometimes do is we actually try to link the messages to service providers, so to actually community-based service providers that then actually can provide either mental health support or other types of support that individuals might be looking for.
Okay, David, I'm sorry. And also, I wanted you to answer one more question while you're speaking. Have you witnessed in your work on counterterrorism any trends in Africa, if you have? Yeah.
I will start and then I will get to Africa. So few things about what governments can do and what governments should not be doing. So the first thing that governments should not be doing is try to censor or control the internet, because that has proven to be unsuccessful and created more distrust between the government and society, and specifically those vulnerable individuals. So that's one thing. Second, experience on government's productions of counter-messaging have shown that they are not the most successful exercises. There's one research from a government, I wouldn't mention the name, that shows that for every dollar invested in the production of a video on counter-messaging, so let's put it this way, every $100 of investment have reached one person, whereas you compare it to productions made by Daesh and others, every $1 invested have reached 100 people. So the ratio is 1 to 10,000 in terms of effectiveness. So meaning that governments are not the most credible voices when it comes to production of counter-messaging. And the only difference, by the way, the quality of the government-produced materials was higher, the video was better, everything, it was promulgated more aggressively, and still the ratio was 1 to 10,000 in terms of reach, not in terms of even impact. Governments are not considered authentic by those audiences, and therefore they should probably not be doing it. What they can do is to create environments that allow other players to step in. And other players could be people who come from within the society, who know the grievances, who could reach out to those people and convey to them messages that resonate, messages that companies like Moonshot are willing to offer about loneliness, messages of seeking help, etc. And the third thing that they can do is to develop partnerships with the private sector. The private sector has moved in the last few years in particular in the counterterrorism space from being an observer to being an active player. I don't want to dwell too much about the reasons. There are many reasons for that, but most of the major companies want to engage in it, want to do something good, want to contribute to the global threat that we're seeing, and they have wealth of information, wealth of experience. They know their audiences better than governments, because if they know that this audience is interested in soccer, wine, or McDonald's, they probably know also what's bothering him too. They can offer a lot of help, and many of them, as I mentioned before, are willing to engage, including the biggest platforms in the world are willing to engage, are willing to do something good. Just lastly, on Africa, what we've seen in Africa is, by the way, very similar to what Mariam mentioned in Afghanistan, is that the offline engagement is far more important than online engagement. Specifically, by the way, when it comes to counter-messaging, but also when it comes to radicalization. It may not be true for the entire world. I think in Europe, in the US, we will probably see other figures, and online engagement will probably be no less important than offline. But when it comes to Africa, it's mainly offline. There are parts of Africa where there is no internet connection at all. So it's mainly offline engagements that drive the radicalization process.
Cool. Mariam?
I wanted to share a report that I had read that was developed by GIZ and the importance that social media, digital media plays in Afghanistan. They did a survey within 5 provinces, and the survey had included government officials, civil society, youth, etc. And they found that 81% of the people that they had surveyed absolutely believed anything that they read on Facebook. Absolutely everything. So if they were that President Ghani, who's the current president, had passed away, they would have believed it. Even if they saw him on TV, they would have thought that this was recorded. That is how intense the social media platforms play in Afghanistan. And I think that we should all, when we're going back to our countries, really reflect on society and see which tools play such an influential role and how we can best use those platforms to positively influence our public and to engage with them more. Remember, one thing that you have to keep remembering is engagement with each other, engagement with your community. I can't stress that enough.
All right. And one question that keeps popping up is the algorithms. If I look at something that's violent or extremist, the platform is going to keep showing me more of that. How do we combat that? Franz, if I could start with you.
Our observation at Moonshot has been that, I mean, the big tech platforms have made progress in removing harmful content. YouTube, Google, Twitter, Facebook. Like, if you look back a couple of years ago, the internet was awash with jihadist propaganda telling people to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda. We don't see that so much nowadays in English and other major languages. Coming back, for instance, to the Maldives, where I work, you know, it's a very small nation of about 400,000 people. These people, they speak Divehi, and they share their propaganda, very good propaganda, by the way, or very sophisticated propaganda, in the local language, Divehi. And the big platforms don't seem to be able to take down that type of propaganda that is in languages other than English, because the Telegram channels, for instance, in Divehi that I monitor, they have been there, they are very robust, they have been there for months and for years. Same with Facebook pages. So the progress has been very uneven across languages. And if I may, another point is also the progress has been very uneven when it comes to the type of extremism that we are looking at. I think we have been very good at removing Islamist-inspired violence from social media. But what about the new threat that is coming, especially in Europe, from the violent far right, but also violence against women? So we need to apply the same standards that we have applied to Islamist-inspired violent extremism to other forms of violent extremism. And there is more to do in this realm.
All right, so we have 6 minutes more before we open it up for Q&A. I just wanted to quickly ask Mariam, when you said it's not enough for us to just hide behind technology or even just rely on technology, but bring in a human element to it, what do you suggest we do to develop counterterrorism narratives? I feel like that's a really trendy, like a cliche thing, but what can we do?
Okay, so I have like an allergic reaction every time I hear counter narratives.
Right.
I keep trying to explain to everybody that creating narratives is a form of countering the narrative. One thing that you were mentioning about algorithms, so one of the experiments that one of my colleagues had is he found a Facebook site that was relatively used for provinces to recruit young boys into becoming Taliban, radicalizing them and then recruiting them. And it started out, the content started out with, are you alone? And do you like guns? Do you appreciate strict authority, etc.? And many of these individuals did. And so then they would start out, so then he decided to take a story of a boy, and he created the story that this one boy loved playing with toy guns, and then his father was a police officer. He stole his father's gun and went on a rampage and shot everybody, and then ended up shooting himself. And then at the bottom of the story, he said, that's not the real story, go down. And then he created another narrative. It was a very confusing story, but many of the individuals who started to read the violent content and then scrolled down and read actually a more positive narrative were the ones who started to engage with him. So it's, when it comes to the algorithm, so share negative content, but somehow turn it into a positive outcome. If that makes sense.
All right, question time. The gentleman here put up his hand first, so.
Thank you very much. I was really very much listening to you. Don't you think that today the most important challenge, and I'm speaking from a Southern perspective, the most important challenge for us, Muslim countries, is how to deconstruct the jihadist narrative? Because we know we talk about the platform, we have the technology, but the most difficult issue today is how to deconstruct. We need to work on concept, what you were saying, alternative narrative, 1. 2, I didn't hear nobody talk about education. And this is the most important issue today we're facing, because we find jihadist concept in our school books. So, Mariam, I want to ask you, do you in Afghanistan have some institutions or scholars that work on deconstruction and jihadi narrative in your language? And the same question to Latifa. From Morocco, how do you deal with this issue? I know I'm not going to speak on behalf of my friend, but he did a very good work in the prisons in Morocco through a comprehensive approach, dealing with religion, job creation, entrepreneurship, and also human rights. Because at the end of the day, what is important is how much we share the common values.
Sorry, I forgot to answer your question too, but I'll go to him.
That's fine.
When it comes to, we have the Ministry of Hajj, and we have the Ministry of Tribal Affairs, and then we have the Ministry of Youth. We have so many ministries that work together, and we work with all of the masjids, the mosques that we have, and we work with the imam in the mosques to help us with narrative. So no, we do take certain steps, but the problem is that the imams don't have a connection with the people there. And that's something that I've realized in the past 2 years. And the more I try to raise this, this concern, the more they push me back, because that's not something that anybody wants to hear, that the local imam is not connected with the people. So that's why I say that the government needs to take a more engaging role, interact with the people, surveys, engage with teachers more than the imams, because now teachers have more of an influence than the local imams do. So I totally agree, and I was speaking in a more general platform because it would help all, but it's most of Afghanistan it's mostly radicalized due to the 40 years of war that we have endured. So they have not learned another teaching of Islam. But the government has now changed that approach, and we have started reviewing. We have an excellent female deputy minister now. Her name is Mariam, and she's taken her own initiative to go and review all of the books that content could harm the youth and create new mechanisms. So this is her way of engaging. She took an extra initiative that nobody had, and that's what when it comes to new approaches.
All right, Ms. Latifa.
Yes, I totally agree to the fact that distracting the radicalization or narrative is not a matter only of internet, and my co-panelist said that the offline and the online are also, this ratio is different from country to country. Yes, if we don't have this orientation the same towards the human rights issue, we have to be aware that the radicalization is a complex process, and the facts intervening in this process are really very different. That's why our speech has to be related to the context. We have a cultural approach on that. It's really important, and I will give you one example. You know that the HACA, the Moroccan High Authority of Audiovisual Communication, as autonomous instance, we have been making many studies and reports, and what is obvious in all these reports is that one of the more recurrent example of hate speech in Moroccan media, and it's not a Moroccan specificity, is the misogyny, the women stereotypes, the gender violence. So how to face up this kind of hate speech if you don't have a public policy oriented to women rights, oriented to women empowerment? So yes, to struggle against radicalization speech is not only online, and there is no, it's useless to think 1 second that if you delete harmful contents, it is done, because, you know, even at technological level, we have many examples. When Facebook deleted 1,300,000 accounts during this very special 2018 year, it was rebuilt immediately. The re-emerging of immediately and even more accounts. So the real intervention is also to create in the society good environment at educational level and human rights level and to fight against economic vulnerability. And that's why I am calling also in our continent of more budgets given to media literacy. This is also how the regulators could be very efficient.
You want more budget?
Not only budget. In Morocco, we don't have budget because there is strong political will to empower the regulator. Okay. No, how to have the good status, how to be able to put other people, other actors, other stakeholders with you. That's why it's a holistic approach and really important. I do believe that human rights approach is maybe the good one.
All right, thank you, Ms. Latifa. There's one more question here that she wanted to ask, right? I think you need to switch on but the audience can't hear you. It's not working? All right, if you say it, I can say it out loud.
Check. All right, thank you. It seems like, another occasion where internet companies have actually exacerbated the problem. It's a weird word, but they've actually invented a problem where it did not exist. Because freedom of expression and sharing viral content is so easy on these platforms, and they favor algorithms that basically, lead to a lot more engagement. The video that you said, the Christchurch video, it was Facebook live streamed. The massacre of people in a mosque. And while millions of videos were deleted, millions more popped up in a matter of nanoseconds across the World Wide Web. Okay? So one can never be ahead of the problem. But my question is particularly about end-to-end encryption. Platforms like Telegram, platforms like WhatsApp, so many governments across the world, they are saying, give us the encryption keys because, people are using these platforms, which are all ones and zeros and garbled up communication, to do a lot of nefarious activities, antisocial activities, terrorist activities. But platforms, Apple, WhatsApp, Facebook, everyone's like, hey, we respect freedom of expression and right to privacy, and people have every right to use the platform to say whatever they want to say. How does this play out? There is no winning on either side.
I think you touched on two important questions, and I'll start with the first one. Tech companies have not invented a problem in order to solve it. They invented tools that we all use and enjoy and benefit from. When Facebook invented Facebook Live, I don't think anyone could have predicted that it could be used in the way it was used in Christchurch. And that is true, by the way, for the internet in general, that the internet itself was never developed with governance in mind. It was developed as an open tool that people would communicate with each other, and the problems we're all talking for yesterday, today, and the day and tomorrow would be focused on how to control something that was not developed as a control tool by design. So I wouldn't blame the companies for developing tools such as Facebook Live, but I could say that in our dialogue with Facebook after Christchurch, they are working very hard to try to prevent the next one being using a tool like Facebook Live for such an attack. I know that you've probably seen it in the media that they also closed that option for certain violent users of, or people with violent tendencies at Facebook. They closed the option of using Facebook Live just as an intermediary tool until they come up with a solution that will prevent a tool such as this from being used as the way we used it in Christchurch. When it comes to end-to-end encryption, that's a different problem, because it's usually not used for broad social media promulgation of content. It's used more, the context that we're seeing, it's used more for recruitment, for what we worried most, I would say, for recruitment, for coordination of attacks, for planning, for financing. For that, there is a whole different chain of players that are involved. This is not about the big tech companies and society or regulators. It's about big tech companies and law enforcement. And it's true that in the past, tech companies were kind of saying, we will not give the keys. We don't have any ownership of the problem. That has changed, I would say, for most platforms, not for all of them. Some will remain. And I would say that the problem is here to stay with us. But the cooperation that we're seeing today between companies, including those that developed end-to-end encryption, and law enforcement is far better on both ends, because one of the challenges that we're seeing is also the challenges on the law enforcement side, that you have very few people who understand enough the technology to know what to ask from the companies. So you need to develop, and we're trying at the UN with cooperation that we have with our partners in Vienna and with the International Association of Prosecutors to develop that kind of dialogue. It happened in closed spaces. It's not the big conversations that we have like in the Global Internet Forum. It's closed conversation where we bring law enforcement, the big companies, and us to try to see how they could work together. And I could see improvement, not that we solved the problem so far.
All right, so on that note, I have really bad news. We have to wrap up this panel, but I'm sure our panelists are going to be around to answer all of your questions. Thank you for being a really great audience. And thank you to all of our panelists, Mariam, David, Franz, Ms. Latifa. Thank you so much. You're going to be here, right, to answer the questions? Great. Thank you very much for your time.
I cannot. I'll say very quickly. I could say very different views between you and Miriam, and I'd be happy to continue the conversation because offline, and I don't want to take the time and prevent people from having lunch. But we should get together and try to see what we can do.